Okay, hello again, everybody. I just want to make a short video to walk you through the expectations for course project report number 2, which will be about supersegmentals and prosody. Now that you've succeeded in finishing course project report number 1 and finding a good consultant to work with throughout the semester, hopefully. So this is due on Monday, October 26th at 11 a.m. And as it says up here, this course project report should focus on the supersegmental and prosodic features of your consultant's language. So there's two parts of this. The first is that you need to address the word level supersegmental structures in the language. And number two, I want you to address the sentence level intonation system of your consultant's language. So words first and then sentence or utterance level beyond that. Okay, so for the first part of this, this is going to be based kind of more on topics we talk about in 341 than 441, but are still relevant for what we're doing here. So as we've discussed briefly in class, languages generally fall into one of three types. So there are tone languages, there are accent languages, and there are stress languages. And your job, first of all, is to determine which category your consultant's language falls into. And you can figure this out using whatever resources are available to you. So you can decide this by reading published grammars or research on your consultant's language. But make sure that you confirm by actually listening and talking to them that they actually use the supersegmental structures you think they should use before submitting your report. So I was going to give you an example. So there's a lot of work done on Blackfoot in our program, which is cool. And I've sat in on a couple of sort of elicitation sessions with Blackfoot. And I think the first one that I was there for, they were kind of, the linguists in the room who were not me were kind of thinking, well, is this a tone language or is it not? And when I was listening to it, I thought it's pretty clearly an accent language. So that's how I would describe it based on what I'm hearing. So you may get into a similar situation where what's been published in a text or some grammar about your language says one thing, but then when you listen to it, your consultant is doing something totally different. Another example is some varieties of Japanese are supposed to be pitch accent languages or pitch accent varieties of Japanese, and others are not. You have to listen to what your consultant is actually doing and let me know what they're doing rather than telling me what's published in a text about or some grammar about that language. That's the goal of this project. If your consultant's language is a tone language based on what you have observed, you should do the following things. So it turns out most languages in the world are tone languages, so it's likely that we'll get a few of these in this class this semester, and that might include you. So first of all, if you have a tone language, list the contrastive tones you found in a table at the beginning of your report. So this is just like a pretend little language here that I've made up just to show you kind of the format of how you should do this. You can give each tone a number, but it's kind of mostly useful to kind of describe the tone contour for that particular lexical tone, like where does it go in the overall pitch range of the speaker. If it's 5/5, that means it begins at the high end of the range and stays there. So you could describe this as like a high level tone. This is sort of like the high level tone in Mandarin, so on and so forth. 5/1 would be it starts high and then it falls, so that's a high falling tone, so on and so forth. Just make sure you can identify all the contrastive tones and plot them out in a table like this. Secondly, I want you to provide evidence that this is actually the case in your consultant's language. So after this, list any minimal or near minimal pairs you found in the language which are distinguished only by tone. Make sure you are able to provide contrast for each tone pair in the language. I would also recommend transcribing the tones by writing the tone contour in superscript font next to the syllable bearing the tone. So this is again some made up examples from this pretend language. So let's say you can find an example of a high level tone contrasting with the second one, which is supposed to be a mid-level tone. So like ka versus ka, which is supposed to mean the word clip versus the word bite, whatever, right? You should be able to get nice little pairs like this. Ideally, if you can't get them exactly bang on where the only thing that distinguishes them are the tones, that's still okay. I need to hear examples of the different tones, though, contrasting with each other as best you can find them. And then later on I'll describe this, but you're going to have your consultant speak these tones out loud, and then you record these words and analyze them. If your consultant's language is an accent language or a stress language, you should, number one, attempt to determine where the stress or accent can fall in a word, i.e., can any syllable be accented or stressed? Oftentimes, that's not the case in a language. In a language like English, we tend to get stress initially, but not always. In a language like French, you're more likely to have accent or stress, however you analyze it, on the end of a word, but not always. So look for those patterns. That's the first thing you want to try to figure out, because whether or not there's a pattern here, there are some languages which are consistent, like the language where stress always has to be initial or something like that, or always penultimate or something. And if that's the case, you're not going to be able to find stress contrast in the language, or contrast based only on stress, because that stress is just predictable by rule. So if it's possible for words in the language to contrast on the basis of stress, like English, or accent, then list any minimal or near minimal pairs you can find in the language. So I've got some examples here in English, because English is kind of an unusual language in that it does really have stress-based contrast by themselves. So we've seen this in class before, but there are these noun-verb pairs in English, like an insult versus insult, or contrast versus contrast, or contrast versus contrast, where the only distinction is sort of which syllable the stress falls on. If you can find examples like this from your language, then great. But it's not super common for you to be able to do that. So if you can't find such examples, then simply list near minimal pairs in the language, or for that matter, examples of the particular stress or accent patterns that you've discovered in your elicitation so far. Usually providing 2 or 3 examples of each stress or accent type should suffice. So let's say you have like a language where stress is totally predictable, like it's always on the first syllable of a word. Then give me, like, say 3 examples of words which consistently show that pattern, so that I know that it's there, and then have your consultant record those words so we can hear it too. If you've got, say, most words, same as a language like English, but it doesn't have clear contrast based on stress, where like most of the stress patterns are syllable, like the first syllable in a word, and then there's a few where it's like the second syllable or some other syllable. Give me sort of the basic pattern, some examples of the basic pattern, like the initial stress, and then a few examples of the other patterns, just so I can see that stress can shift to other places sometimes in the language. So yeah, part C, whether your consultant's language is a tone language or a stress accent language, you should also make recordings of your consultant producing each of the words in your table of contrasts. E.g., if you're working with a tone language, then record your consultant producing each one of the words in the table of tone contrasts, which might be a fair number if you have like a lot of tones. But, you know, if there's 4, what is that? Like 3, 2, 1, that's 6 contrasts, right? It's not too many. The best way to do this is to number each word you want them to produce and then write those words down, ideally in the language's native orthography, in the order you want to record them. So these recording instructions are kind of more appropriate for when you could meet face-to-face with your consultant and record them like in the sound booth or something. This could still be useful if you're recording them just over a computer, though. So basically you have a list of words that they're supposed to read through. They're numbered. You got the English translation for each one of them, and then ideally you can write them out in the language's native orthography too. So like if they're a Mandarin speaker, they can just read the Chinese characters without having to, you know, translate from English. And as you go through the list, you should read out the number and English translation of the word while they read the word in their language. You can, if you're okay with this, still use the recording facilities of the Phonetics lab and the university for this purpose. It's totally okay if you just do it over a computer, though, or some other means at home. That's fine. But keep in mind that the quieter the environment you're recording in, the better data you're going to get out of this. Whatever you get out of that process, when you submit your report, you should upload the recordings to the Dropbox on D2L, so that I can access them and listen to them and kind of see how well the actual sound files match up to what you've transcribed in your reports. There's a note here I want to make. I'm going to make this again and again throughout this semester as I talk about the course project, but you can write things out in the orthography of your consultant's language to help them like produce items for reports like this. I don't want you to base your analysis on what you find in the orthography of your consultant's language, though. So that's like a whole different theory of what's going on in the language, which may or may not be true. I don't need to know about it either way. And in fact, for the most part, I would recommend that you just not include any orthography from your consultant's language at all in your course project reports. It usually just leads to greater confusion than is necessary or advisable for that matter. And I'm going to add here as well, I've said this at least a couple times, I think, but if you have gotten, say, minimal pair sets from some grammar or something like that, or if you've gotten any information from Wikipedia on the about what's contrastive in the language your consultant speaks, then cite that source in your report. Put it in a little references section at the end. Cite the grammar, cite Wikipedia, cite whatever as the source for that information. Yeah, just be honest with that, and everything will be okay. Okay, second part, sentence level intonation. So for this portion of the report, you should also make recordings of your consultant producing the following types of sentences in their language. And I've given you a variety of different kind of intonation types here to work with. So first is a declarative sentence, like phonetics is awesome. Second is an echo question, which is what you say when you want to kind of confirm what somebody's just said. So you could say like phonetics is awesome. Or a third is a yes-no question. In English, we invert the subject and the verb for this. So is phonology fun? Fourthly, a WH question, which uses a WH form like this. Why do you study morphology? And fifth is an alternative question, which gives you options like do you prefer syntax or semantics? I think we all know the answer to that question. It doesn't matter. How do you ask the question in the consultant's language? That's what I want you to find out. So I want you to record your consultant producing sentences of this type, and you can make up whatever sentences you want to make this as fun or as relevant as you need for your consultant. And ideally, you can kind of like have this lined up in the same way where you would read out the English translation of the sentence, and then your consultant just produces the sentence themselves. I got a phone call. I got to take a break. I'll be back in a second. Okay, sorry about that brief interruption. Let's get back into it. So we've got sentences of sort of different syntactic types, which should correspond hopefully to different intonational patterns in the language. You're going to record your consultant producing all of these sentences. And once you have those recordings, I want you to try to make Toby-style transcriptions for them. And when you do this, please just focus basically on the intonational pattern of the utterances rather than on their segmental content, which you might have a hard time kind of deciphering. It's going to be hard enough to figure out what's going on intonationally. So just please focus on that for now. What are the intonation patterns like that you see or hear in the utterances? Are there any consistent differences that you can observe between the declarative sentence and the questions, or between the various questions themselves too? And when you do this, our framework for understanding intonation at this point is Toby, the system we've learned for English. Toby has been applied to other languages, but it's not what we've learned. It's not like the IPA for intonation. It's not like the same set of elements applies across the board universally in the world of languages. When Toby gets applied to other languages, usually they add other elements in there which are not necessarily in the English system. And the grammar of it works slightly differently too, or it can work differently as well. So you can try to apply the elements that we've learned to your consultant's language, but there's no a priori reason to expect that the two intonational systems will work in the exact same way. So your consultant's language may have an entirely different system of pitch accents, phrase breaks, boundary tones, etc. So please try to approach your analysis of the intonational patterns they produce with an open mind. Just try to basically capture the patterns that you can observe and that seem to be consistent across the languages. Give it your best shot. The main goal here, I'm not going to grade you on like accuracy. I will point things out if I hear them that you might have missed, but try to give it the most reasonable transcription you can based on what you know. And lastly, along with your recordings, I want you to submit a brief report on what you have learned about the suprasegmental features of your consultant's language. This report should include your tables and lists of production items, along with a general description of the kinds of contrasts you have found at work in the language. For your Toby-style transcriptions of your consultant's utterances, I'd also recommend that you include pictures or screen captures of the corresponding pitch tracks of each utterance in your analysis. And if you don't know how to do that, I'd be happy to show you how you can create one of those if you need help. It's usually not that hard with a modern operating system and computer. Yeah, and also for what it's worth, if you have computational or limitations on sort of your computational resources, I guess you might say, we do have computers you can use in the phonetics lab if worse comes to worse. So you can contact me about using those too, all of which are able to do this sort of analysis and presentation for your report. At the end of your report, you should list any other thoughts or concerns you may have about what's going on in your consultant's language. Since this report reflects work in progress, this section also gives you the opportunity to say things like, I have no idea what's going on here, or there's one sound that confuses me, but I'm trying to figure out what it is, or so on and so forth. Any other relevant information that might explain the circumstances by which you came to the conclusions you presented in sections 1 and 2. It's okay not to be perfect when you are preparing these reports. The main goal is to learn something in the process, or to kind of learn the process of learning things from firsthand data. It's impossible to expect people not to make mistakes as part of that process. And in fact, it's kind of better if you do kind of push yourself a little bit and start making a few mistakes, so that you can kind of get a sense of like how far you need to go, or how far you need to push yourself to learn something new in this way. Okay, so be that as it may, you can make mistakes in your analysis and in your transcription, so on and so forth. That's kind of expected, but please note that being part of being a good scientist is knowing how to present your thoughts clearly and in a form that others can understand. For this reason, I will be grading your reports on presentation quality as well as content. You can be as concise or as verbose as you like in your reports, but please try to the best of your ability to be clear and coherent when you write. I need to understand what you're saying when you write it. And what you write needs to make sense and be relevant to the topic at hand. So just make it as simple as you need to get those thoughts across to me. Also, please note that the suprasegmental features of a language are often difficult to perceive and are generally not as well understood as the segmental structures of a language. And this is why I want you to start focusing on these features early in the project while you still have lots of time left in the semester to improve your understanding of them. I'll just give you a little anecdote here before wrapping this up, but in 1994, a long time ago, I took a field methods class in college. It was about the language Shona, which is a very cool language to study because it has all sorts of fun morphology and syntax things going on, and some cool phonetics too. The thing is that we were so entranced by like the morphology of it that we went through a whole semester not noticing that it was a tone language, and then by the end we're like, oh, there seem to be some tones going on here, and we just had missed like months of being able to analyze that. So don't miss out on that with this language that you're working on. Try to focus on that first because you're kind of not used to thinking about it if you're used to sort of just reading a language in segmental form. Lastly, for a digital copy of this report, I would prefer that you submit it in PDF format. Just because I can be assured that the fonts will come through if you're using IPA fonts in your document. You can try to send those in Word format, like in a Word document, but oftentimes that won't work. And I get other formats from people as well. So do your best to make sure I can see what you're actually writing, because what's the point of writing it if you don't? And you can always, like I said before, just write it out longhand and take a picture and send me that picture if you want to as well. So with all this in mind, please let me know if you have any questions about the technical side of this or the linguistic side of this or whatever. I'm happy to help. And again, because I'm recording these in the summertime, I should have more time in the fall to help out with that side of things. Okay, have fun, good luck, and I'll be looking forward to reading your reports.